Welcome to Inspiring Heartfelt Conversations. My name is Barbara Morningstar. This series is presented by Inautumn's Cocoon, which offers education on a range of end-of-life topics in the forms of talks, workshops, and courses. Today, my guest is Tara Souch. Tara is an experienced wilderness guide and registered clinical counselor who is passionate about grief education, nature connection, and protection. She lives and works on the west coast of Vancouver Island in Canada. Tara's academic background includes a master's in counselling and a certificate in wilderness guiding. In her current professional world, she works in private practice with Pacific Rim Hospice Society and with Lumara Care and Bereavement Society. Today's topic is connecting with nature to heal in our grief. Welcome, Tara.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've talked about this. I have this deep love and passion for nature, and I know that you do too. So I'm really excited, even though it's a tender subject, to move into and celebrate the greatest gift that's around us. That, we are hoping to invite people into today with more passion and respect and care.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well said. It is the greatest gift around us. Absolutely.
Okay. So my first question is for you, what initially drew you to want to connect and invited this passion for nature within you and your life?
Yeah, that's a good question. It started really early on as a little girl, as it probably did for many of us. I think, I do have a half brother and half sister. However, there's an age gap there, so there's about 8 to 9 years between us. So in many ways, I feel like I grew up like an only child in those early years. And I think for myself, I can remember. I remember being bored, and I remember just figuring out how to have fun and how to play. And I can remember there were days when I would be out visiting my dad and my grandparents, and I would just decide that we have this beautiful golden retriever. And I would just decide for a day that I'd get on my hands and knees and I would just crawl around and follow my dog out to the field and the forest and down by the river. And I think that's, for me, the earliest memory I have around nature connection and play and curiosity. And as I got older, I attended camps. So I grew up in Ontario, and camp life is big. If you talk to people from Ontario, it's a thing, right? Like camp life is a thing. And I was really fortunate to go to camp and then also to work in camp, moving up to management in camp as I got older. And there's just a magic of being with people, overnight, staring up at the stars, the sound of the lake, the sound of a paddle going in a lake, the sound of the zipper on your sleeping bag. Everything about it is just so magical. And I think in those experiences, I was just so aware of, the unique connections I was having with other people, and also the unique insights that I was having about myself and the appreciation I was having for the natural world around me. Mm-hmm. So those are I would say the early experiences that really cemented this for me. And then, when I was in management roles, we would get referrals from youth that were part of Children's Aid Society and things like that. And, I got more and more excited about what kind of youth with adverse circumstances could we, bring in and watch them have this really pivotal and sometimes challenging, experience. So I think that's kind of when it started, definitely. And then, that kind of planted the seed of, how could I shape my career in a way where I can work of service and be in nature.
So bridging to that, you have done a lot of work with organizations like Outward Bound and the School of Lost Borders. Can you talk about how that's influenced your work and what that taught you working with those organizations?
Right. Yeah. Well, so I guess, where the journey sort of began even a little bit before that. So I moved out west, I packed all my things, moved to BC and seeking grand adventure in the big mountains. And then I enrolled in the wilderness leadership program at Capilano, based out of Squamish, and had all of this amazing training in outdoor expeditions. I mean, being an Ontario kid and being on a sea kayak trip for the first time and seeing, experiencing low tide for the first time. I mean, that is like Christmas. Like, I think everyone should just find someone from Ontario who's never seen the ocean and just take them out to low tide for the first time and just like experience their awe and wonderment. It's pretty fascinating. So, I had taken that course and I was sort of set that I would, I would work as an outdoor guide, but simultaneously I was working and living in Whistler and had an opportunity, one, to work for staff housing with Whistler Blackcomb, and then also to work with Whistler Community Services as an outreach worker. And I really got into the outreach work, which kind of put the guiding on hold, because then, of course, I went and did my master's and got really interested in that. And then it wasn't really until I did my internship at CanAdventure Education, which is on the North Island, which is a wilderness therapy program. And that's actually where I was able to actually have a glimpse of how I was going to bridge these two. Because previously it felt like I had to choose one or the other. I was either going to be an outdoor guide or I was either going to be a therapist. And this program, CanAdventure, founded by Karina and Greg Stevenson, ran for a decade, really amazing program that was very much steeped in rite of passage and nature connection. That was actually my first and probably most pivotal experience in terms of understanding how they blend, then setting me off on the path to, discover and train with the School of Lost Borders, and then later work for Outward Bound. Yeah. And I think through that experience, it was, there's sort of there's an adventure therapy, right? So there's there's a therapy around, getting outside and pushing yourself and what you learn about yourself. And that's one aspect of it. But with CanAdventure and also with School of Lost Borders, and even Outward Bound, when they do their 24-hour solo component, I discovered this other part around story. And, what happens when we spend time in solitude, in nature, and the way in which we communicate and share and receive messages with nature. And then, we come back and we share that story. So, for example, at CanAdventure, near the end of the program, after the youth had been there for 28 days. So near the end, they go and they do a 24-hour or 48-hour nature solo. And so all of the staff come together. We circle up and we send them off in a really ceremonial way. They go and they have this experience. At that time, their families actually come back. And so when they return back from their experience, which is an initiation, all the staff and the families are there celebrating them, ready to receive their story, and then listen to that story and mirror back to them the gifts that we see in them, not interpret or change in any way, but actually just see them. The idea being that that initiation experience and being seen, by community and by elders, then supports them to really show up fully and know their gifts in the community. And that was the piece that really got me hooked. And the School of Lost Borders does that work. So that's why I went down to the School of Lost Borders and have continued to train with them. And then now also do that work.
Beautiful. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And we will touch more and go a little bit deeper with story later in the conversation. But just before we started, I asked you, it's a huge presence and sense of First Nations and Indigenous cultures throughout Canada and on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. Can you share with me how that culture, their traditions have influenced and their love for land and nature have influenced you and the work you do now as well?
Right. That's a good question. So for myself, and to be honest, I would, if I'm being honest and vulnerable, early on, there's a discomfort in that, right? Because there's this acknowledgement of myself and my ancestors and the history of colonialism and what that means. And so it's, how the journey has really been about, how do I situate myself as a white colonial woman who really, appreciates ceremony and nature connection. And yet I wasn't taught this from my family or from my ancestors. And there's such an awareness around cultural misappropriation and what does that mean and what does that look like? And one of the things I'm really thankful for that I heard very early on, going back to CanAdventure, so Karina Stevenson, a beautiful mentor of mine, Métis woman, she had said once to the group, I can't remember exactly what we were doing, but that everybody has a birthright to connect to nature. And for myself, when I heard that, it almost allowed me to kind of ease in and feel empowered and okay around finding my own way with nature connection. And I think that was really pivotal for me to find my own way, because even when I reflect on my journey around exploring spirituality, and I mean, sort of Eastern philosophies, right? Like so much about yoga and Ayurvedic and all these things that never really came from what I know of my ancestors or my culture. And there's been a real journey around me now discovering that, right? Like my Celtic roots and things like that, and how to bring those in is really pivotal for me to find my own way. And so in my journey, I would say that was essential for me to feel grounded and rooted in my own nature connection. And then moving out here to the West Coast and being so fortunate to be invited in and working with different First Nations communities, I'm always forever grateful for any little bit of wisdom or learnings that I have around what they share with me in terms of, I think the language actually is one of the things that I really find pretty fascinating in terms of, the words for things that there isn't exactly a word for in the English language. I think of, for example, there's a word for actually, coming together and sharing the teachings with the young people, like that's captured in a word. So definitely the language. I think the big lesson that I have around Indigenous people and land connection is the stewardship. So when I think about how, when you look kind of geographically here, the long-standing connection that nations have with land, and I look at the colonial history around coming in, identifying a piece of land as having resources, building a town, staying there, extracting as much as you can, abandoning the town, and then moving on into the next piece of land where you can extract. And that is so, so different than the thousands of years that different nations spent stewarding a piece of land. And of course, there'd be, village sites that they would move to seasonally. But I think that's the thing that's the biggest teaching I have and the biggest admiration I have that I hope we can all tune into to, save this beautiful planet that we are so gifted to live on, is how do we really steward the land, and how do we stop looking at land as something that is to be extracted from, that we can just take resources from, that's separate from us, and that we can just manipulate it to serve our own wants. How do we step into stewardship and reciprocity, I would say is the biggest teaching that I have. Mm-hmm.
I actually saw Dances with Wolves again the other night. And I actually was blessed to know one of the producers of the film who had a deep respect for that culture and nature. And there were moments I cried more watching it again around that theme and the reverence that they had for the land, and then just the different approach to it, and made me reflect on how I hold that,
Right.
And so it's a very powerful film to really revisit for that theme and reflection, right? So
absolutely. Yeah. And there's so many, I catch myself sometimes when I'm putting together a presentation or something, I might start with, using nature for therapy. And I'm like, no, take out the word using, right? Like incorporating, being with. Just really trying to be careful of that.
Well, that bridges to another thing I wanted to just touch on before we go deeper into nature connection and grief work itself. We talked about our age difference. I'm in my early 60s now. I was not brought up with technology. I played in nature for hours. I still go out in nature as my solace. But your generation was brought up immersed in a world of technology. So how does nature fit into there's gifts in technology? We wouldn't be able to have this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And quite frankly, it's more of a wilderness to me to go in technology. I'm having to take deep breath because I can't talk to anybody. I have to deal with this inanimate thing. And I'm so tactile. And so used to people, and hospice deepens the connection in that. And then I have to go in, and then there's nobody there. And if I put the wrong password in, it mucks the whole thing up, So that's a wilderness to me in a different way. But anyway, so for someone immersed and this is part of your upbringing, your life, the technology, how does nature weave into that?
Right. Yeah.
Artfully, I want to say.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I always begin, it's like I'm trying to get some kind of street credit with my elders. I always try to begin with, I had to do my first science project on a typewriter. So I'm not that young. I didn't have a cell phone until I was in my 20s. But yes, absolutely. Certainly through my 20s, technology was everywhere and has been everywhere. But I'm fortunate that my childhood actually also was, more sheltered than the children today. I didn't have that experience of being around adults and them just being on their phone. That wasn't part of my, my growing up. Yeah. And, I get asked that question a fair amount, and I honestly don't know that I have an answer for it, other than I just really believe that ultimately, our love of nature and our connection to nature is so innate in us. I don't see it being lost to technology. And maybe that's because I get to do these trips with young people and adults. And maybe that's because I have this constant reminder when I'm out tripping and I take a step back and I just look at the group and I watch them playing with the rocks or, just gazing out at the ocean. And I think I'm fortunate because in my life, I get these windows frequently where I see people disconnect and fully immerse. Mind you, we ask people to put their phones away, to not bring their phone on the trip, which, that's a huge edge for people these days, right? Like that's a big ask. You kind of don't know how it's going to land. Almost like, are we going to lose them? And sometimes there's a lot of resistance, certainly, but more often people are open to it. And they just express so much gratitude for it, and really appreciate the opportunity to fully disconnect. You kind of ask yourself, when's the last time I took, 5 days without being on my phone and being completely immersed in what is with me right here, right now. I do wonder, I hear about, the sort of the AI or virtual reality, that we might see in the future. And I wonder what that might mean. I mean, might people have a preference to sort of put goggles on and go to beautiful places versus going to the places themselves? It's an unknown, I suppose. And I guess that is something that motivates me in the work that I do. If I can be involved in having opportunities for people to immerse in nature and then watch them really solidify that. I know that person is going to be more likely in the future to make choices around nature protection in terms of, how they are in the world and what they do in the world. So I'm hopeful. And I think we're all kind of unsure in terms of how that's going to unfold, technology versus nature.
Mm.
Yeah. Or maybe we shouldn't think about it as versus. Probably want to think about it in some way that they can support one another. Yeah.
Well, there's gifts in everything, right? So where's the art in honoring each and blending them and just be enlivened by that, the gifts that are presented, but in a way that's healthy for us as individuals, right? So, Okay, so how then does nature connection integrate into your work with individuals who are grieving?
Yeah. So there's so much around. So really it comes down to, it's the cycles of nature, right? And so that is what we see in terms of the way that the seasons move. We see that in growth and rebirth and composting. I mean, all of the cycles around death, rebirth, transformation are so rich across the board in nature. And I think specifically for grief, that's why I enjoy working with nature the most, because it's normalizing. And so for people to have an opportunity to really engage with the normalcy of life, death, rebirth, because it's something that, grief and death and dying, so often it's just like, yeah, let's not talk about that one. Let's just push that away. And then of course we all face it in this life. It's something, we don't want to talk about or has been taboo. And yet it's something that's right there always, in life at some point. So, I mean, I would say also even not just, when someone is grieving, I really like to have the conversations early on, if we can introduce people to the cyclical nature of life, death, birth, rebirth, transformation. So I appreciate it in that way. And then I also really appreciate it for people in terms of, I find it a really helpful way to connect to something that is bigger than we are, and to connect to spirit. And when we're grieving, the big questions that we have, right? I mean, everything that we thought we knew when we lose someone we love is just thrown into absolute chaos, and the big questions of why would this happen and how could this happen, and I believed this and I lived this way, so why would this pain come in this way, and why on earth would we be asked to walk this path in life to feel this kind of pain? And when we're able to go into nature and our opportunity to experience a spiritual connection, which is so different for every person, but ultimately evokes a sense of being connected to something that's bigger than yourself. I often hear people talk about, different messages, or they can't believe that particular animal showed up at that particular time because their loved one, and there's a story there. And so there just is something magical that happens. And in my experience of being with people and their story, I just have not seen that kind of magic happen anywhere else. There's magic in conversation and connection, and being in an office. Office is a safe space for, important disclosures and those kinds of things, and tuning into something really big that's bigger than yourself, and that can provide a kind of healing that sometimes you can't even put words to, or a kind of knowing. Yeah.
Well, and so let's deepen that reflection around story. You hear of native totems and vision quests, and so listening comes into play there. So can you speak to listening and how that weaves into the whole reflection on story too?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I participate in fasts. So I do 4-day and 4-night wilderness fasts, or we call them wilderness vigils, in nature. And then I also host them, and facilitate them for people as well. So just as you mentioned, that it's definitely a great place to experience some very deep listening. And I can speak to, my own experience around that in terms of deep listening, and to go and to be in nature, to go to one place for, 4 days and 4 nights, to not have any food, which puts you in an altered state. And then, to begin to participate in self-generated ceremony, which is really just beginning to do what comes up for you in your heart, maybe something you feel that you hear, or just, that whispering that we talked about earlier on. And so then to participate in self-generated ceremony, perhaps to bring a rattle with you, and it sort of heighten that altered state. I know for myself, I have had an experience of hearing wisdom from my ancestors, of having connection with ancestors that I didn't even get to meet or know. I also had connection with my loved ones who had died. They've shown up in different ways or different experiences to share something with me. And it's so interesting because, when you think about listening, it's always an interest. People are like, what do you mean? You saw them right there? Or, you actually heard their voice. Did you have an auditory hallucination? And it's no, it wasn't like that. It's something different. It's a different kind of listening. It's a different kind of hearing. And that's why I really loved when you said whispering, because I find I'm always actually kind of looking for the language for this. And I don't know that I have found it, because it's enigmatic, it's that which is mysterious and hard to name. What's important when we do these experiences is having a group of people who've experienced it as well, being available when you come back, so that you can, and it's your choice, you can share what you want to share around the experience, but that your audience isn't someone that you need to kind of convince or explain it to, because they get it. Sort of there's a shared understanding of that there. And I actually wrote about this in an article. There's one experience that sticks out to me, with someone who had even said, someone who had died came to them and said something. And as this person reflected on this experience, they said, it doesn't even matter if I made it up in my head or if it really happened. It's what I needed to hear, So it was just so well put, the way she said that, it's what I needed to hear for my healing. And I'm not even concerned about whether I made it up or not, or, what that is.
Well, I remember, just in sharing, because I have such a love for nature, and like I said, play in it for hours, and still, because we're blessed in BC to have it. I remember in my late 20s going through a really tough turning point, and going for a run in the woods. I used to love to run in the woods by myself. And I got deep into the run, and then you get into that endorphin high that happens naturally with your body. And I was in this sort of blissful state running. And then all of a sudden, the whole forest started to dance in a different way, like the leaves and the trees and it was just kind of magical, but then almost overwhelming. Right. Because it was taking on a different texture and tone and expression that I had to stop.
Right.
And when I stopped, this light came through the trees that I just looked up into light. But as the light came through the trees, there was this just sort of sense of a peace and a love that came over me. And then I got, like you say, like a whisper of a message about a teacher I needed to find, which I ended up finding, and knowing who it was exactly when I met this teacher.
Yeah.
And who has been pivotal in my life. And it was also about the direction and purpose of my life.
Yeah.
And I just stood, and I can't explain it to anyone, and I'm not going to go into more detail than that, but it was for my heart, and it just enveloped me through the beauty of the light that was this golden light that was coming through the trees. And I just received it, and it filled me.
Yeah.
And then when it was done, I remember continuing on the run. And then as I came out of the forest and got closer to the subdivision I was living in at the time, my mind came in and went, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean, the teacher? And what does that mean? And I just watched my mind come back on. And I was like, get out of there. Like, that was really pure. But it was fascinating. It's kind of like when people come back from near-death experiences. Had Bruce Grayson.
Yeah.
Something in how I opened it, that filter went out of the way. And this beautiful thing through nature and the light and the moment and the trees, the leaves came into my heart. And then later that other part wanted to come in and analyze it, but it had no place.
Yeah.
And I watched as it unfolded, and I know now exactly, because I'm older now, what it was all about. But it was an invitation at the time. It was magical.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So as I was preparing for this, I was looking back on all these moments in nature that just spontaneously have just, like, I just want to cry. Like, they've just been beyond, my life has been guided, and just through these whispers and through my dreams in a way I can't even express at times. And nature's been a big component of that, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's so much that comes up when you say that. I think of people I know and myself, and those, like, you know, in those deep, dark, suicidal moments, you know, and getting out there and feeling that, you know, and how pivotal that is. Yeah. That's beautiful. And then also I thought about, just quickly, because I don't know that it's been said, I guess it's obvious, but it's what's possible when you have space for that. And so sometimes we don't even notice that in a day, it's like, you know, wake up, phone's right beside you on the night table, take a look, diving into this other world, you know, depending on what your life looks like in terms of, is it, you know, getting the kids to school and this and hopping on and doing the job and doing the things and and the busyness and the busyness and the busyness and the distractions. And it's about leaving the opening and the space for the kind of experience that you're talking about. And that's what happens when we leave space and we open ourselves up to it. And I think sometimes we might not notice just how much we're caught up in the busyness and the distraction. And when we're distracted, the space for that innate heart wisdom connection with nature, you know, it doesn't have opportunity to speak to you.
Well, and bridging to that, you highlight, I've seen a presentation that you did, 4 key invitations: reflecting, feeling, attention, and curiosity. So can you speak to those a little bit more, like those 4 invitations?
Right. Yes. And so these 4 invitations in the presentation that you had seen, I talked about when the presentation was on incorporating nature-based therapy, working with youth. And so this was a model around how to do that. And I should say that what's interesting, so as I learn the cyclical nature model, which is also, you know, it's also the medicine wheel. It's also the 4 Shields teachings. It's also flow learning by Cornell. It's also many iterations of the natural learning cycle. So they're all sort of the same. And they all kind of use different words around this. So the words that speak to me when I do this work is curiosity, attention, feeling, and reflecting. And basically, you can lay that over top of, you know, this circle, sort of, if you think of the 4 seasons that we experience here in the Northern Hemisphere, we can lay that out as a circle. Everyone would probably agree that that's a cycle and a circle we move through. You can lay these 4 points out on there. And so I would associate curiosity being part of springtime, right? Where there's this awakening and there's this rebirth and this sort of bringing forward, and things are blooming, and it's so interesting, and we're getting spring fever a little bit, we're awakening. I would connect that with the spiritual side of us. And then when we move into summertime, which is attention, we're fully in our body. The sun is directly on our skin. We feel that. We're in the presence of it. We're so aware of our body as we're playing, and we're feeling the heat, and we're swimming in the cool water. Our attention is very attuned in summertime. When we move to the fall, of course, things begin to darken. We go inward, and that's the feeling that I talked about in the conference that I presented at. So that's the feeling phase, the going inward, the feeling our grief. And then when we move into winter, that's the reflecting, which is, it's cultivating the wisdom. So wintertime is the time when we need to be diligent about our survival. Not as much now because we have a lot of comforts, but in more ancient times and in older times, we had to really think about, how are we going to survive this thing? And we do that by community and coming together. And so that's in the winter shield. And so these phases, curiosity, attention, feeling, reflecting. So it's the same, I've kind of put that on a big picture of the seasons. You can also put that on the big picture of life phases, right? From birth to being a toddler to a teen to an adult and an elder. I mean, it's infinite, the layers that you can put on this wheel. But when you're working specifically with people in nature, that model is really helpful for guiding the experience in terms of the invitation to just get outside and begin to be curious. What does being curious look like? Just observing. You're watching a spider. You're curious. You're looking around. You catch a glimpse of a spider. You watch the spider. You're very curious about the movements, and all of a sudden, as you're watching, you are honed in, and there's an attention that you're deeply focused on, perhaps watching the spider weave its web. And then as you're in that attention phase, you organically move into a type of feeling. You have some kind of feeling about what you're seeing. And then that feeling actually propels you into the reflecting. So there's some kind of reflecting that you might get. And that might be around, if you're grieving, is there some sort of feeling and reflecting around, here I am, like I'm rebuilding my web, this is me doing this. So that's the interaction. I would, an example of an interaction of working with the curiosity, attention, feeling, reflecting.
Yeah. So can you give us an example then? I mean, you've shared some photographs with me of some sessions with people out in nature with grief. Can you give me an example of how you would take someone out into nature to do nature connected grief work?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, the first thing you do is I get out of the way. I really get out of the way, and I look at my role as someone who's really just holding a container, being mindful of safety, and being someone that is available for the story sharing afterward. And so, what that will typically look like is allowing space for us to be separate. So kind of, establishing some structure around, let's take 15 minutes. We'll do a sit spot or maybe a wander. We might, one person might walk ahead, one might walk behind. We'll decide for X number of time we're going to, have this distance between us and just have this intentional time where we sink into nature. Or we might just, I'm going to go up the beach over here. You're going to go down the beach over here. We'll take X number of time to, just wander and let it be. So you're getting out of the way, and you're allowing someone to have intentional time alone with nature. There's an opportunity to offer different prompts. And so, you might have a sense of where someone is at, or, a prompt could be, go into nature and find a symbol of your grief and bring it back and share the story. So that could be an example of a kind of prompt that you might want to share with someone. And there's many, many different prompts or questions that you can ask. Everything's an invitation. You can, if it fits, take this. If it doesn't, that fits too. Really allow, and you used the word spontaneous earlier, which is so important, really allow for the spontaneity. So there's no attachment to a particular structure or process. And so, you don't necessarily have to tell the person about this experience that they're going to have, but sometimes, very often in groups, we will do a teaching ahead of time around the cycles of nature, because it begins to get someone thinking about where they might be in their life phase. And then they begin to think about where they want to move to. So it can be really helpful, but you don't have to. And basically the person goes out. You can teach them a little bit about self-generated ceremony too. And that's just, if there's something that needs to be, is there a structure that needs to be created? Does it need to be broken? Does something need to be buried? Does something need to be burned? There's so many different rituals and practices. So you can offer them those opportunities as well. Always framing with the reminder of remembering to ask, right? So if you're going to pick or take something, can you pause for a moment and check in and ask, before we do that thing that we love to do where we just extract. So you create the space for them, and then what happens for them happens for them. I've seen so many beautiful stories or different things that might have been made in nature. And so what might happen is they might come back and they might bring something back from nature that they've created. Sometimes it's amazing. Sometimes you're just blown away, and they're blown away because they've weaved some kind of beautiful, headpiece or bracelet. Like, they've created this thing and they're like, I didn't even know I could do this. And it's, it's pretty amazing. Or maybe they've created something and they want to walk back and show it to you, or, maybe they just want to share the story. It always looks different ways. And so then myself, as a guide, somebody holding the space but not interfering with it, will allow a chance for them to then share their story of what happened in nature. And then I will be cautious, because it's not for me to interpret or change or put my, I'm not going to say, oh, well, you saw an eagle. Did you know that eagles mean da 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 da? Because that's, what I might say is, I'll ask questions. So what did seeing the eagle mean to you? What do you observe about eagle? What can eagle teach us about how to live our lives? What are the gifts of eagle? So it's a lot of questions and curiosity. And that enriches their, usually tends to enriches their experience and reflection on what has happened for them. And it continues to marinate for them too. So I'll often say, you might want to journal this and come back to it later. I am also cautious to say, hold this story and really tune into, when and who you share the retelling to. Because it can be so sacred that sometimes, we can come back from these experiences and we just want to tell everybody. But if someone's not truly interested, or they're not ready to hold it, can feel really hard to kind of end this magical thing, and they're not holding it for you. So I talk a lot about that as well, in terms of that awareness around who and really tuning in who and when to share your story. And that story is theirs, that will continue to evolve and share different wisdoms with them, likely throughout time.
Well, I love the spontaneous piece. As you were saying that, I was actually just thinking about something that happened after my husband died. A couple of months after, I actually went to Tofino with my sister. And I had his ashes, and I knew I would do a different ceremony with the family later. But he loved the ocean. He loved the ocean. So I took a little bit of the ashes, and I decided to do a ritual to walk down Long Beach. And my sister was with me, and there was a different celebration we were there for too, that we were honoring together. And so I had the little bag of ashes, and I had this intent, I was going to go, we walked the thing, and I was in the mode to release him into the ocean. And I was in the mindset, and we got out to the this one sort of jetted reef kind of thing there, like a little piece of land that went out. And I went ahead because I said, I just need to do this part alone. And she stood back, and I got to the very edge of it. And I ever so gently, I was just going to, in my own way, just kind of let them flow into the ocean. And just as I did this massive wave came out of nowhere, grabbed the ashes, grabbed the bag, and I was soaked. And I was kind of like, well, that's not how. And my sister just started killing herself laughing because my husband was a real force. He was like, I called him my gale force wind. And she just started killing herself laughing. And she said, well, that was him.
Absolutely.
And I just had a moment, and I started laughing, and I thought, you're absolutely right. I mean, there couldn't have been a great, like, get on with it. Here's the nature. Here's the wave. Here is life and all its glory and its magnificence and its strength. And that was so metaphoric of who he was, because he had this love for life until he died. And so even that, as you say that, and she was laughing, I'm trying to do it in this.
Yeah.
And then it was so perfect because it was him, right?
It always is. It always is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so true. I mean, and that's it, earlier when you asked why grief and nature, because nature has it all. I mean, it's the light and the dark, and it's the trickster. It is also trickster, and it's sacred, and it's profane, and it's all of it all together. And so it's important to remember that when we get maybe these romantic notions of how something's going to look. Yeah. It is so much bigger than us, and like you said, spontaneous and trickster, and how beautiful that in what you had imagined, actually you're sharing a laugh. You're sharing a laugh with your sister, with your husband, with the ocean. I mean, that is just that much more beautiful, to be open to the spontaneity. I mean, whether you're open to it or not, it's going to come for you probably.
Well, and I think what you say, I'm a licensed glider pilot, so I'm up in the air in a plane with no engine that's cradled in the wind. Wow. And people think you're just soaring all the time, and it's this. Well, sometimes you're soaring, like you watch an eagle in a thermal going up. But other times, if you're around a mountain, you get slammed by the turbulence, and everything in the cockpit goes up. And so you go from the grace of it to the stirring up of it, and that, or you're dancing with the clouds as they form around you, and you discover it has a whole different language you didn't even know you could be invited into as you play with the clouds, right? So
absolutely.
It's so profound.
It really is.
So beautiful, which is why I honor what you're doing, because when you lean in and really listen to it, it's magnificent in what it will teach you and reveal to you, right? So you've shared also an image of footprints in the sand that we're going to have put up. Can you tell a little bit about that session with someone and how you came to that place? Yeah,
well, actually, so it's actually my own. And so it was a program actually that we were doing in the summertime, a grief program. It was a pilot project, so there were some logistical things that happened, and the result was that myself and two other guides actually just had a day. We had a day for ourselves. And so what we did is the three of us decided to take intentional time to separate from one another and to go have, nature immersion. And for myself, there was some big grief that was happening at that time. And it was, there's at that time, it's the personal grief, but then there was also, it was big grief. It was real sorrow, confusion around how there could be such tremendous violence and harm to other humans, and the injustice and how Yeah. Like it was very, at that time, it was really, really, really raw for me. And so, holding stories and then hearing bigger stories had me in one of those places of like, just, like what are we doing? How can this harm exist in this world? Like, what is this? And so, for myself, I took some time alone and sobbed really hard. I'm on the sand in the ocean and just like scraping so hard in the sand. Like there was anger, right? Like I was really moving this anger and scraping and like kind of like cutting my hands a little bit, dirt under my nails, and just this raw expression of frustration and anger around what was happening. And because I was in a place where I was listening and open, there were, from what I remember, there were other things that were coming up for me around, once I let the anger move itself, how to bring the love in. And so, then I drew the big heart around, this space that I had been in with like digging and sobbing, bleeding. And then I remember there being a message around like how to continue walking through it. And so there's footprints in it. So I got up and I kind of, how in this work, I'm a counselor, how am I going to continue to walk through this like pain, right? Like there's and hold on to the love and hope, because that's what I believe. I got to bring that. If I'm going to sit with people. I need to be attached to my sense of love and hope. And we're walking through the nittiest, grittiest shit that you can like imagine. And so that's what was coming up for me in this picture in particular. And that was just things that I was kind of hearing or sensing and then expressing, because I have this beautiful beach that I'm on, this secluded space to be with the elements and engage in them in that way. And I was fortunate because I also had these two beautiful women that I was out with, who we were all working through much of the same thing actually. And then I had the opportunity when we got together, and it wasn't very formal, because we're friends and we're co-guides, but what is it that we want to share with one another, and what is it that we really want to have witnessed by one another? And so the trip actually involved quite a bit of that. It was interesting. The logistics just kind of allowed for this kind of day off that doesn't typically happen when you're guiding, but it just happened to on this trip. And so there was some really beautiful sharing and witnessing that we were able to do for one another around what was coming up for us in this beautiful space where we got to be to hold some big things for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, the image in the sand is beautiful. And I can understand now almost the dimensions of the imagery that you created an expression through that whole journey in your heart, right? So healing.
Yeah. And important, because it's, I talk about this work and I need to do this work. If I'm going to keep showing up, this is pivotal. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, because we're all connected, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the profound reflection back that we get in this work when we're with somebody else. It's like Dr. Kearney, I always go back to, this is such a profound conversation, but he talks about the wounded healer, right? And so we're supporting someone else, but it touches in our own wounds and invites a healing as well, which is what you're talking about here. And we're seeing that with a lot of caregivers now on the front lines, right? And not to forget themselves and their own grief as they support others, where nature can come in to help heal in beautiful ways, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so that's a photo that's mine. I wouldn't I don't know that I've taken photos of other people's, but when I think of just other examples, I can think of someone once who did, it was kind of like a genogram in nature. But the thing that was so beautiful, related to grief is it was a grandmother, and they also included, the babies who had been miscarried, or the babies who had been aborted. And so it really was this really whole picture of, in nature. It was sort of a nature mandala, sort of genogram type. And it's the things that people create are beautiful. I mean, mine's a little bit gritty, but you can imagine, some of the beauty that people, if you've just got an open beach in front of you, and what you might, the materials, and maybe the sticks or the salal, or the different, like all of the things, stones and the pebbles, and sort of the what comes to people when they create in that way to express their grief, to express their inner feelings.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that leads me into a different kind of question, because we truly, in British Columbia and in Canada, nature abounds. And especially on the West Coast here, it's gifted to us in ways that just takes your breath away. Every day. I have the ocean over there. I can go to the mountains in a heartbeat, right? So, but there's people who are going to be watching this that are in cities surrounded by skyscrapers, or in places where the land is more barren because of maybe something that's happened in their environment. And so all these glorious stories we tell, and the person saying, yeah, but I look out my window, I see a skyscraper next to me. How am I supposed to do nature connection with my heart and grief in that circumstance? Can you speak to that?
Yeah. And I would say there are very few places that I know of that don't at least have, a park, or even, the smallest piece of nature. So when I was talking earlier about the curiosity and attention, I was talking about a spider. And so, you can go and you can find a few blades of grass, and you can just watch this little area. It doesn't need to be grand nature. And when I think about some of the most transformative times, it's really when I am actually honing in and just observing a small aspect of that. So nature is everywhere. If you're quite limited, do you begin to grow a couple plants inside? Do you experiment? Are you a plant person? Might you become one? Get a couple seeds and experiment and play with bringing in plants into your space, or even just grabbing a piece of dirt and playing with the dirt, or holding the dirt, or feeling the fine grains of sand in the dirt. There's really micro ways to engage with and understand nature connection. I mean, just gazing up at the sky, watching the clouds. So those are still available. I would say that there's always something that's available. And I would say that if that is your experience where it feels as though that's really not available, I also go to, what are we doing to these spaces, right? And how do we advocate? And does that mean, attending one of your council meetings when there's a proposal to put up, X number of buildings and get rid of the park and da-da-da? It's like, we need to advocate for more natural spaces. Absolutely. Because it's not, when we plaster everything in concrete, that is not sustainable for water absorption and growth and things. It's really, it's quite strange. Some of the things that we have done that are very counterintuitive to our survival and the way that we've used space. And nature is available in the cities.
Well, and you see these photographs where there's concrete and there's a crack and somehow a flower.
It's like the best image, right?
I love those images. Like, it's just, I am determined.
Exactly.
No matter what you do, I am going to show myself. Yeah. And the resiliency that I have, and this little And you could contemplate on that little flower that's arrived through that cracked piece of concrete for hours, really.
It's amazing.
Because that in itself is a miraculous expression of the profound beauty of nature in action, right?
Yes. Yes. I'm so glad that you brought that image forward because it is one of my favorites. I love it. Even just when you see the like root systems of the trees disrupting like this perfect flat concrete, and it's just like concrete is like getting pushed and bent. Right. Oh, it's so good.
Yeah. It's powerful.
So
taking people out into nature, can you summarize the benefit of doing grief work in nature that you've observed and experienced over the years?
Can I summarize it? Yeah. I would say connection to something bigger than yourself. Connection to spirit, messages, symbols, whispering. And just again, the normalizing of life cycles. And it's something that actually, I think this is also really important. So often when I work with people who are grieving, gosh, I hear this from and so many people, and I've experienced it too, right? There's this feeling of, I can't keep telling everybody this, it's like there's this feeling of they've expired their time, they've expired their time that they can be the grieving person. So their senses, the friends are sort of like, well, when are we going to move beyond this? And it doesn't have, as we know, grief isn't linear. Like there's not a time when it's like, great, I'm over the grief, so now we can get back to the way brunch used to be. It doesn't happen in that way. And so the thing that's so beautiful about nature is that it's continuously available. Like it's a resource that isn't dependent on, and community is so important. Please, I don't want that to be misinterpreted. Community is essential. And we know that our community members can be at different phases, can be in their own grief, their capacity, availability is always shifting and changing. And if you're able to establish and really leave time for nature connection, it's just there for you. I mean, any time of day. It's not on a schedule, the middle of the night, you can get up and you can gaze up at the stars or look at the moon, when it might not be the time that you want to call somebody up on the phone because, you're really in it. So I think that maybe that is the thing that I think is most remarkable about nature connection for grief is just that it really is consistently available at a time, especially a time where often people feel like they feel like they're a burden. They feel like they've just, and they don't, and they feel it's lonely. It's so lonely. Gosh, grief can be so lonely. So I think that's really, really essential when grieving, to have this anchor, right? To have this touchstone, this thing. And it's gonna be there no matter what. Like if you're having a good day, a bad day, sobbing, full of hope, full of despair, you can show up with all of it at any time.
And go hug a tree and the tree will understand.
Totally. Yeah. It's just there. You hug that tree, you'll feel the roots under you, you regulate with that. I mean, gosh, there's a whole, it's neat, all the books, that have been published recently around the science behind it all,
trees and their connection too. Yeah. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's one of the greatest networks of connection that there is. It's phenomenal, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And so when we're with that, I mean, just imagining what that means for our being, and our energy.
Well, even, in around here, the big older growth trees too, it's kind of like going up to a natural elder who's seen way more than you. And if you wrap your arms around it, there's a sense of, I have this thing for trees, but there's a sense of a reverence, of a wisdom that you just anchors you, as you said. I mean, that may sound a bit out there for some people, but there's been times in my hospice work when I was in it full time in a professional role where, like you, the weeks of deaths I'd seen or the sorrow I'd had to be present to, just going out in nature and connecting with the trees or the wind just lifted something and gave me a strength and reminded me of the wisdom of life in a whole different way, right? So
absolutely. I really relate to that. An experience I had recently visiting a tree, and I was observing this tree, and it was in a park, and there was parking lots and buildings around it. And, you know, especially lately, right, there's this feeling of unknown, right? Like, what's happening in the world? Like, where's this all going? And I was, you know, with this tree and having a conversation with the tree, and like you're describing, this long, like so many years, I can't even imagine, wisdom. And this tree has been here growing, you know, amongst other trees that have been cut down. And there's always this unknown. And yet the tree continues to grow. It continues to be rooted. And the tree has no ability to control the actions of humans. And, you know, when it will be destroyed and made into this. And I was just really reflecting on that, you know, that there can be chaos and destruction happening all around you. And you never know, you know, at what point are you going to be in relationship with that? And yet continuing to grow, continuing to stay rooted, continuing to reach high, you know, expand, blossom, and just this steadiness, you know, there's this real steady quality that I really appreciate with trees and rocks. You know, I see them both as like our greatest ancestors, right? Gosh, think of rock formations and like mind blowing, you know, big boulders that have been moved through glacier fields. And I mean, all that it has seen, and the rumbling, the sounds that must have been happening that rock was there for when things were shifting and moving. And yeah, just such long, steeped years and years and years of wisdom.
Well, and the grounding of the trees and the rocks and the fluidity of the water and the wind woven in. I mean, there's just so many, you know, structure and flow, and just, it's magical, really, when you step into it and open to the wisdom and gift it brings to your heart, right? So on that, as we're now coming to the end here, how has your heart been changed by this work?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's funny as you say that. I'm like, oh, my eyes are starting to water. Yeah, how has my heart been changed? That's such a good question. I mean, it's been expanded. It's really been expanded. It is so, I feel that it is so big, and that it can hold so much. I mean, in this work, grief in particular, what an understanding of how deep our expressions of love are. And, you know, in relation to nature, it's hard to put words to that, but that it can hold it all. You know, it too is expansive, you know, and perhaps that's maybe the mirror that is most inspiring for me is the expansiveness, you know, expansive heart, expansive connection. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Well, and I really appreciate this conversation with you and you modeling it so beautifully, because oftentimes people think, oh, if I go to do grief work, I'm going to be in a grief group, or I'm just talking one-on-one with somebody in an office somewhere. And I'm not, and I was the program director for a hospice for many years, and we had those programs and they were amazing for people, but that's not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah.
So for you to show a different way to engage and explore and take the tenderness of what grief brings to the heart and have it transformed through the natural connection to nature and the natural world and how it whispers and speaks to us is a lovely different image for those that maybe the other doesn't suit, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say too, it's so, I mean, I obviously love working in counseling and I see so much value in it. And, my sense isn't that everybody needs to go to counseling or have a counselor. My sense is that we have a tremendous amount of intuitive wisdom and healing ability in us. And so, my hope would be that perhaps for someone, maybe parts of this, inspired them. And maybe it's about finding, a like-minded friend or just somebody that they go and have a walk with and maybe just play with some of these ideas or possibilities and hold space for one another. It isn't, sometimes I get a lot of requests around, because I'm not taking new clients in private practice, and well, what's a referral and who else is doing this? And I don't actually know. I know maybe a few people, but it's not that you need to find the professional to go and do the thing. Like I said, I really get out of the way. But I just really encourage people to tune into their intuitive wisdom and the wisdom that can come from nature immersion. And it's available, and it doesn't need to come in sort of a professional package or something that you need to pay for. And I would also lean to, I do think in counseling, there are many conversations that are best had in the privacy of an office, and that is a really important safe container. I mean, definitely, like very few, most of my session, well, now it's online, but I wasn't always, it's not like every session I'm out in nature. Probably, less than half of them even. What I really lean towards though is nature immersion opportunities. So I love to facilitate week-long programs. I really encourage, if there's a program that strikes your interest in there's so many different programs out there, but, signing up for whether it be, a wilderness guided experience or program. I think that the immersion piece is pretty amazing. When you can do multiple days and nights in nature, I think that's where it gets real juicy. Yeah, to sort of wake up with the sun, go to bed with the setting sun, experience the difference of the weather that you can have over that period of time, sort of the group bonding that happens over the period of time. So, where I hope to be is that I'm doing, less and less private practice, and that I'm doing more and more trips with people. That's really where my passion around it really lies, is that immersive experience for multi-days.
Well, your passion and love can be felt, and your heartfelt attention to the tender subject of grief can also be felt. And I just love how you have created programs to help people heal through that nature connection. And so thank you so much. Well, I'll put you right up on the bottom under the video with your website, Tara Souch we want the CA, TaraSouch.ca, Canada. And thank you again for coming and sharing this time with us. I know it'll be valuable to so many people. Appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much for the invitation.
Okay, good. Okay, take care.
You too.